And so we close out another year of music. This wonderful 2024, which to me, and I know I say something similar every year, but I think most people will follow me on this one, has been the greatest year for music in a very long time. With so many great albums releasing every single month, it was almost a nightmare to keep up, but what made it so much more tolerable was the fact that so much of it was so good. There were honestly shockingly few albums I heard that I outright dislike, and so many nice surprises from all across the musical landscape. Whittling this list down to 50 was the hardest it's ever been, and there were at least like 20 or 30 albums that I was desperate to see make the list, but just couldn't fit on here with the sheer quantity of masterpieces and near masterpieces that came out in the past 12 months. I rewrote this list a solid dozen times, and even still, I don't know exactly how confident I am in it because there was simply so much. This will likely be the second longest video I've ever made when all is said and done because there was just too much to say and too many pieces of work that I felt an obligation to do justice to. It feels as though I will be finding great music from this year for the rest of my life. And so, before we get into the list proper, I want to give a shout out to my patrons for helping me keep doing this. This has been one of the most chaotic years of my life, with moving and losing my job and then going through the unending gauntlet that is searching for work in 2024. And you folks helping me out financially as well as socially through the Discord has meant more to me this year than it ever has before. There's a lot of music that didn't make this list, and so like last year, I'm going to be putting out a Patreon exclusive unscripted video talking about the biggest albums of the year for me that just couldn't hang with the rest of the list. You can get access to that as well as my Discord community for just $3 a month, where you can cancel at any time and still remain a member of the community. Thank you all for another fantastic year, and without further ado, let's get right into the list. Starting us off at number 50, I've got one of the biggest surprise blow-ups of the year, and that's Cindy Lee with Diamond Jubilee. In a world where radio is basically obsolete, this record is a broadcast to dead airwaves. 2 hours of the most beautiful, wistfully nostalgic pop and soft rock music out there. The record acts far more as a mood board than an album proper, and it captures that tone in a way I've never heard before. Next, at 49, is the album Resort by Ski Mask, who I've been following for quite a while now, and with this new record, I think he's finally released his masterpiece. Lush and meticulously crafted soundscapes fill this record to the brim, and peppered all across are fragments of just about the best IDM you'll ever hear, all sequenced in such a satisfying and beautiful way that 60 minutes goes by like it's nothing. Up next, for my number 48 pick, is Muntau Tuja, the new album by psychedelic metal legends Oranzi Pazuzu. Since the band's debut in 2009, they've been drifting incrementally away from black metal and into a wholly unique blend with bad trip psychedelic music, and now we're as far down the rabbit hole as we've ever been. A swirling, apocalyptic nightmare of distortion, guitars, and synths. This wormhole won't be letting me go anytime soon. In my number 47 slot is the new Julia Holter album, Something in the Room She Moves. I've been waiting with bated breath for this record basically since the previous Aviary released back in 2018, and I'm pleased to say that the wait was worth it, and that Holter remains one of the most flawless discographies in art pop this century. Here, she's playing with far jazzier textures than usual, leaning heavily into her chamber music background to build up some of the most enthralling soundscapes to date, which gives her plenty of room to spread her song structures and melodic wings far and wide. Meanwhile, at 46, we've got the new collaborative album You Like Music by Galen Tipton and Death's Dynamic Shroud, who, at this point, it would be more shocking if they didn't show up on one of my year-end lists. They've had a fantastic year in 2024, continuing their monthly fan club releases to fantastic results, but here with Galen, they've managed to create something totally unique within their catalog, a glitchy, deranged sugar rush of a deconstructed club album. Tipton's sound collage background blends perfectly with the sense of atmosphere and melody DDS are best known for, and the result is one of the best projects by either artist to date. Next, at 45, is the first of several abstract death metal albums we'll see on this list, and that's the new Gigan album, Anomalous Abstractigate Infinitesimus. Their first album since 2017, the band fully recaptures and reinvents what made their music such a standout to begin with, that being their truly unrelenting sense of cosmic, almost Lovecraftian horror. Riffs careen through the void at 1,000 miles a minute, but trapped inside each one is a latent atmosphere of dread, a dread that the band makes good on at every opportunity. This is not an album to be missed, no matter how cheesy the band logo is. Sticking to space for a minute, my number 44 pick is the sophomore release by Belgian jazz and ambient composer Nala Sinefro, Endlessness. Sinefro first cut her teeth in 2021, blending the aforementioned genres on Space 1.8, and on the follow-up we see her refine and improve upon that original combination, while also adding a heaping helping of classic-style progressive electronic to the mix. The result is a transcendental and utterly unique experience, one that can accompany you just about everywhere you're willing to take it, whether that be to bed, to class, or to the outer reaches of space. It's the album that doesn't stop growing on me whenever I hear it. And on the topic of ambient, kind of jazzy prog electronic records, at 43 is The Closest Thing to Silence, a collaboration between Ariel Kalma, Jeremiah Chu, and Marto Sofia Honer. Ambient music is already a very tight balance to strike, where it's easy to get carried away and end up just making a sloppy, jostled mess. With 3 people all creating simultaneously, all with ambience as the stated goal, and all completely improvising, it would seem like an outright impossible task, and yet these 3 musicians work together so perfectly to create what is handily my favorite ambient record of the year. On the opposite end of electronic music, we've got Igloo Ghost at 42 with Tidal Memory XO. First of all, this has got to be one of the hardest album covers of the year, right? And what's more impressive is that at every turn, the music matches this tone with some of the most out there, wacky, and grimy club music you're likely to have heard this year. The arrangements dance around your skull thanks to one of the most dynamic and crisp production jobs in electronic music this decade, and the whole project stains the waters with creativity that pours out of every crack and crevice. I've been watching Igloo Ghost grow for a while now, and I think this is exactly what he should be doing right now. At 41 is a record you'll have to do some serious digging for, and that's Armand Hammer's Black Label album. Much like White Label a couple of years ago, this is a tour-exclusive record of outtakes from their recent Diabetic Test Strips album. I saw the duo earlier this year, but unfortunately they weren't able to get the vinyl into Canada in time, so I had to resort to other methods, and I'm glad I did. Test Strips is still the best record they've ever done, I think, and here we see that even the tracks that didn't make the cut are among the best rap music out there, just wholly unlike anything else out there right now, and the meeting of 2 of the greatest minds the genre has ever seen. Next at 40, I've got the new album by sludge metal legends Thou, Umbilical. Known more often for their doomier, more atmospheric works like their albums with Mizmer and Emma Ruth Rundle the past few years, Umbilical acts in stark contrast to those expectations with one of the most aggressive, in-your-face, brutal records the band has ever done. Without sacrificing the dynamism that made them so interesting to begin with, the band leans all the way into violence and massive riffs, upheld by one of the most monstrous mixes you'll hear on a metal album this year. I think it's their best album, and it shows that they've still got plenty of gas in the tank for non-collaborative records going forward. At 39, which might be a little low for some people, we've got the new Charli XCX album, Brat. If nothing else, this was hands down the biggest album of the year, and while I still have a handful of Charli records I'd take over it, it's undeniably one of her most fully formed artistic statements, and to see it get such universal acclaim and recognition has been absolutely surreal. It's her least veiled attempt to make an honest connection between her audience and her real self, and because of that, it's messy and unkempt in these really compelling and occasionally powerful ways. Even with all that aside, though, it's just the club-oriented collection of bangers I've been hoping for, an evolution of the hyperpop sound that she helped uplift and pioneer, matured to its classiest form. even if this isn't my favorite album of 2024, this is the album of 2024. Meanwhile, back on the death metal front, 38 is the new Blood Incantation album, Absolute Elsewhere. I've been waiting so patiently for the follow-up to Hidden Histories of the Human Race, which to this day might be the death metal album I've heard the most times, and here it is. After a diversion into Berlin School and Space Ambient a few years back with Time Wave Zero, I was excited to see what new tools the band would have at their disposal for their third full album, and the answer apparently is the coolest Tangerine Dream Pink Floyd space metal fusion that I never knew I wanted, but can't get enough of now that I have it. I'm a big advocate for entry-level metal, for good music that can smoothly usher new fans into more extreme and difficult music, and I think for death metal, this is the best we've seen fit that description since Gojira's run. This is a damn special album, and one I'd recommend to just about anyone. Next at 37 is an album I was convinced would never come out, and that's the long-awaited Almighty So 2 by Chief Keef. Delay after delay after delay plagued this record, and considering the last few records and tapes ended up being non-starters for me, I had basically lost hope that the sequel to his classic mixtape would be any good, and yet, somehow, it managed to come out, and not only did it release in a finished state, but I think it's probably the best thing Keef has put out to date. He's taken the helm on production here, and it's some of the most mind-blowing drill you'll ever hear. Just listen to Jesus for an example of that. But what really sets this apart for me was the unprecedented vulnerability we get to see on some of these tracks, especially in the back half of the album. It's worth keeping in mind that Chief Keef was blowing up in 2012 when he was only 17, and even now he's still in his late 20s. We've watched him grow up, and so this project is incredibly satisfying, both as a sequel to one of his most beloved early projects, but also as a bow tied over his whole career up to this point. Then for number 36, we've got the most recent release on this whole list, and that's 3776 with their third full album titled The Birth and Death of the Universe Through Mount Fuji. Helmed by Akira Ishida and longtime vocalist Shiono Ide, this double album epic stands head and shoulders above their previous J-pop classics as one of the most ambitious and progressive pop albums of this decade. Playfully arranged instrumental palettes cycle seamlessly across this 70-minute runtime with bopping bass lines, spacey retro-futuristic synthetics, and almost city pop style guitar lines peppered across the whole thing. I've not spent a long enough time with this record to get a grasp of what the concept is lyrically. There's a lot of spoken word storytelling delivered in Japanese that, at time of writing, has no translation, but what I can say is Ide's singing and delivery, paired with the track titles and musicianship behind her, does wonders to convey the scale of this thing. There's so much to love across it, and I'm going to be spending a lot more time in 2025 getting to know its intricacies. Anyways, back to weirdo death metal. At 33, I wanted to shout out the new Piron album, Exhaust. In a year where we were even more inundated with weirdo metal than usual, Piron managed to stand out by simply being weirder than the rest. This thing blends more traditional disso death with some of the most intense facets of mathcore and noise rock, to the point where I would almost compare it to brutal prog records like Hypermagic Mountain and Torture Garden. Exhaust's biggest strength is actually in how inaccurate its title is, though, because for as intense and unhinged as it all is, the structuring and songwriting is so unbelievably tight and well crafted that it doesn't ever have the opportunity to get exhausting. Instead, it remains exhilarating for the entire 40-minute runtime, and by the time it ends, I'm ready to loop it right back to the start and hear it all again. It's a banger. And speaking of bangers, at number 32, we've got the two kings of bangers, Joey Valence and Bray, with their sophomore album, No Hands. For years now, I've been saying that white rappers need to put down the Eminem CDs and pick up some Beastie Boys records, and this album is all the evidence I need to uphold that claim. Rather than just slavish tributes to that early moment in hip-hop history though, No Hands sees the duo bringing the sound seamlessly into the 2020s with production that keeps up with and frequently exceeds the standards of contemporary club hits, while still maintaining the nostalgic style they're pulling from. The real stars of the show here are the songwriting and personalities behind the project though. JVB are so unbelievably, knowingly uncool, and they play into it in such a way that it is impossible not to be endeared to them. And once you're hooked, you'll start hearing some of the funniest middle school disses, knowing nerdy references, and crazy infectious self-confidence. This is music to feel good to, and there's not a lot of music this year that I had more unabashed fun with than this. Next, my number 33 is a bit less feel-good, but no less excellent, and that's Colin Stetson with The Love It Took to Leave You. If you haven't listened to Stetson's albums before, there's still a pretty good chance you've heard his works by means of soundtracks to a wide array of films, games, and television series. His style of minimalism-inspired saxophone playing is, on every level, completely unique, and as such, it's very difficult to adequately explain the power and appeal behind his work without resorting to purely abstract terms. It's a world of music he's essentially handcrafted from scratch and has spent over a decade refining and exploring, building entire civilizations on a land all his own. As for why this record stands out in his catalog, a lot of it comes down to the core mood he's working from here, and that's dread. Stetson's horror works, like on the score for Hereditary, have always been my favorites of his, but by taking that darkness and stripping it of outside context, forcing it to stand alone, he's able to divine a sense of wonder and mystery into his work without sacrificing that raw, undeniable discomfort. This is possibly my favorite work from a true master of their craft, a creative force we will be talking about centuries from now. Staying on the heavy side of music, although for very different reasons, we've got Knocked Loose at number 32 with You Won't Go Before You're Supposed To. In terms of quality modern metalcore, it's been a while since a big name emerged and forcibly took the crown that Every Time I Die and previously Dillinger Escape Plan left behind. With this record, Knocked Loose have unequivocally taken up that mantle, both on a critical level and in terms of popularity. Metal and hardcore that reaches the mainstream is frequently, historically, toothless and sanitary, especially in the past decade or so. Because of this, it feels even more miraculous that this band has managed to reach such an unbelievable level of success, to the point where just about a month ago we saw them on late night TV with Poppy performing on Jimmy Kimmel Live of all things. This success story is one that is incredibly deserved as the band continues down the more atmospheric path they carved on their 2021 EP without sacrificing an ounce of aggression and heft, and even raising the stakes and anger as their rage against all forms of Catholic guilt and abuse take listeners by the throat and force acknowledgement. This album is proof that sometimes success in niche genres doesn't mean selling out, and the public can be a lot more discerning of quality than we often give them credit for. At 31, I've got the most recent album by Ali X, Girl With No Face. Previously a pretty bog-standard synthy alt-pop artist with a couple of bangers, this new record sees Ali joining the decade of 80s revival that is the 2020s with what is, for my money, the best nostalgia-tripping pop album we've gotten from this whole wave. The range of influences is obvious, but executed at such a high level of quality that it often surpasses the originators. The opening track, for example, is a clear pastiche of Bonnie Tyler, but with a captivating sonic atmosphere and a vocal performance that is pretty much unmatched this year. This track overwrites Holding Out for a Hero, but entirely for me. Listening to Ali's voice is like shooting up to me. The range of registers and timbres she's able to fly between consistently is euphoric and addictive, to the point that I frequently find myself looping back specific choruses and peak moments on songs just to get another hit of it. Combine that with unbelievably rich and varied instrumentation and production, and you've got the recipe for an album that, while it may not be remembered as an innovator in any meaningful way, should absolutely be remembered for the sheer quality on display in every respect. Next up in my number 30 slot is Monarch of Monsters by Violet Pony. This is an artist whose work I've always had an immense amount of respect and admiration for, while still finding it to ultimately be not my thing. Her work has always been no doubt impressive and mind-bogglingly eclectic, but a lot of the sounds it was combining didn't have as much impact on me personally. My interest was piqued, however, when I heard that this new album would be Violet's first full-faced dive into rock music, with cited influences like Swans and Genesis, and uncited but clear ones like Shushu and the Mars Volta. The result is an album that is no less scattershot than her past few records, bouncing at will between musical ideas and aesthetics, but at no point does it feel like one segment is a qualitative step down from the last. Much like the Ali X album I just talked about, the vocals are what really blew me away this time around. Violet has always had a really impressive range, but to me she's previously had a lack of consistency in her performances, either in tone or pitch. On this album though, it's night and day. There is not a second of singing on this whole record that I can complain about for literally any reason, and oftentimes it's mind-blowing to even imagine trying to sing the way she does on it. For a lot of people, I'm sure there's going to be some trepidation around the furry aspect of the record, but honestly, if that's enough to fully put you off a great record, you need to suck it up and either get with it or get out, because as you'll continue to see, furries are making the best damn music out right now, and this is no exception. Following that, at number 29, is maybe the most quote-unquote brutal album on this list, and that's Gore Grind Legends' Viscera Infest with Teratoma. Hailing from Oita, Japan, these guys have made a name for themselves, putting out some of the most caustic, gory, and grotesque grind ever put to tape, and on Teratoma, I think they've pretty conclusively reached their peak up to this point. Every second of this thing is in one of two modes. Either it's one, the most berserk, unintelligibly fast thrashing you've ever heard, plinky snare and hissing crash cymbals assumed, or two, the grimiest, dirtiest, most caveman slowed down riffs you could possibly imagine. In either case, you'll be hearing basically the peak of heavy music this year, and if you're like me, you'll be having a blast doing it. It does everything good Gore Grind should, in that it somehow is just as infectious and hooky as it is disgusting. Give this thing a spin if you're into heavy music and see just how addictive it is. You won't be disappointed. On a more accessible note, we've got the comeback record of the century at number 28 with The Cure's Songs of a Lost World. To be completely honest with you, if you'd told me back in January that this album was coming out this year, I'd have laughed in your face. This thing has been through so many delays and has been in development for such an ungodly amount of time that I was fully expecting them to just silently cancel it and sweep it under the rug, just continuing to tour as though nothing happened. Luckily for us, not only is it here, but it's good. This is the best thing the band has done this century by an absolute landslide, and if I'm being honest, it pretty cleanly bodies basically everything they did in the 90s too. The way they manage this is by constantly looking forward, refusing to dwell on the sounds of their classic material, and instead pushing forward through and past the decades of music that they directly inspired into a new era for the band, one that is patient, lush, and melancholic without ever going sour. The sound of this album is completely unmatched in post-punk this decade, rich and teeming with detail begging to be uncovered with time, and paired with songwriting that makes those repeated listens so inviting. The big talking point with Songs of a Lost World is, for good reason, Robert Smith's voice. The man is approaching 70, and still he sounds not only identical to his younger material, but in a lot of cases he sounds better, more matured, and multifaceted in his age. Combine this with some of the band's best melodies across the board, as well as everything I just mentioned, and we have pretty much the gold standard to which we'll have to hold every classic band's comeback, because I can't think of a better one to this point. Then, at number 27, we've got a surprise new album from Kendrick Lamar GNX. Kendrick has had an absolutely historic year in 2024, bouncing back from a great but widely controversial album in 2022. We saw him start and then unequivocally win what may be the greatest rap beef of all time. In the process, he released 4 of the best songs he's ever made, reminding the world why he's such a generational talent to begin with, and landing himself the biggest stage in the country as the Super Bowl halftime performer for 2025. Riding high off the back of all this, he randomly announced this new album, GNX, and then, within minutes, the album was here. There was no promotion necessary. He'd done enough throughout the year that we knew to be looking out for him at all times. Within hours, debates were already raging about whether or not this was a real album or if this was a mixtape leading up to a real album. And while that's not quite for no reason, I do think it's a pretty dumb reason. See, this is pretty handily the air quotes laziest album Kendrick has ever made, mostly being disjointed bangers, vibes, and bops, with little in the way of an overarching narrative. On a surface level, I can understand the confusion, but I've been increasingly frustrated with people's inability or unwillingness to dig deeper with this record because, under the surface, this is one of the most thematically detailed albums of the whole year. After almost 8 years of seeing him work through personal and emotional turmoil in his music, this is the first time he's felt truly secure in his position, and with that security, he chooses to uplift those around him. Drake was the sacrificial lamb that needed to die for a new wave of culture to prosper, and this album sees him planting the first seeds. There's so much more to talk about with this record, and if you want to hear me talk about it for like an hour, you can listen to the most recent episode of my Modulation podcast, but for now I'll say that there's a real possibility that this is my second favorite album Kendrick has ever released. It's that good. Next up at 26 is the new Kim Gordon album, The Collective, staying on the topic of loving tributes to hip-hop. In this case, though, we've got one of the most disarmingly experimental albums I've seen an established artist make in my lifetime. Kim Gordon is best known for her work as the girl in Sonic Youth, but if you're a fan of the band, you know she's a lot more than that. Her contribution to the band was undoubtedly an essential, no, the essential factor that allowed the band to bring noise rock and no wave to the places it went, and rock music has never been the same since. Now, at 71 years old, she's bringing that same vitality and innovation to a new scene, one that you would never expect, trap music. In specific, this record is playing a lot with the aesthetics of rage artists like Playboi Carti and Yeat, but infusing them with the sounds that she helped birth back in the 80s. In concept, this seems like an utter disaster waiting to happen, and to some people I'm sure it is, but I think what makes this such a rousing success is the degree of respect with which she treats the sounds she's adopted. At no point does it feel like she's intruding on a space or attempting to take it for herself. Instead, it feels like she spent a lot of time paying attention to the rebellious anti-music that my generation's youth are creating as an outlet, and relating it back to the sounds of anti-music that her generation pioneered. In creating a brand new fusion of these sounds, merging youth cultures 40 years separate, she's able to so much more thoughtfully examine and contextualize why it is that the youth will inevitably try to turn predominant styles of music into something antithetical to its original form. The Collective is an antithesis to itself, and a fascinating exploration of anti-music across generations. It won't be for everyone, and it shouldn't be. Moving us on into the upper half of the list at 25, I've got the debut album by Corey Lingo, For What It's Worth. Paying tribute to the classic 2000s style of R&B crooners that were basically inescapable back in the day, Corey takes it upon himself to fuse it with the ultra-modern sounds of plug-and-be like Summers and Lil Shine. The result is an achingly familiar and yet totally unique sound, a sound that Corey spends 30 minutes exploring every possible corner of, looping in on itself and weaving this beautiful tapestry of bittersweet passion. For my money, this is the best breakup album in a very long time, fully recapturing that heartbroken singing in the rain outside her window style of male desperation that I think has been sorely missing in love songs the past decade or so. What really sells this record more than anything is just how amazing a singer Corey truly is. For as much of a persona non grata Chris Brown is, and for good reason, his exile from the mainstream has long left a massive hole in the R&B singer conversation, and if there's any justice in this world, Corey will be the first in a new era of artists who work to fill those shoes. for what it's worth, is a lean, tight, and unassailable record, one that has me excited to see where he goes from here as he develops and hopefully builds up a greater sense of ambition on future projects. Nobody is doing it like Corey Lingo right now, and I think everyone needs a little bit of this in their life. Next, for number 24, we've got the sophomore from underground avant-garde black metal band Venomous Echoes, Split Formations, and Infinite Mania. I was put onto this record by Evan, one of the co-hosts of the Modulation podcast, and our resident discoverer of albums no one has ever heard. He showed me a lot of great stuff this year, but this is the one that really stuck with me, and as the year comes to a close, it remains the album that has stayed with me the hardest and kept me thinking about it all year. It should really be no surprise that it is as good as it is. It was released on Voidhanger Records after all, but I think even by the standards of what that label puts out, this is one of the most deranged and inconceivable albums yet. While this thing uses black metal as a starting point to build its sound, there's so much indescribable murk and sludge to sift through to get down to what this record truly is. Harsh noise, psychedelia, brutal and dissonant death metal textures and riffs, and one of the most unhinged and animalistic vocal performances I've ever heard in my life coat this whole album in a layer of grotesque insanity, the type of psychosis-inducing sounds that put In the Mountains of Madness to shame. If you're looking for some of the most abstract and deranged metal music you're likely to ever hear, you don't have much farther to look than this. It's a truly special album, one that deserves a ton more attention than it's gotten thus far, and one that'll be haunting me for a long time to come. And once you're done with that, my number 23 pick will be right there to calm you back down. That's the fourth record by Brazilian jazz pianist Amaro Freitas, Why? Third stream has always been one of my favorite subgenres of jazz. I think the broad range of sounds classical music has provides an incredibly vast potential for different directions you can go. And with this record, we see one of the most interesting and beautiful ones yet attempted. By fusing piano-driven post-minimalism a la Philip Glass or Harold Budd with more new agey and flute-centric jazz, Freitas is able to conduct one of the most hypnotic and soothing pieces of music I've ever laid ears on. Every second of this thing is pure musical bliss, giving yourself away to the beauty and lushness of nature through sound. Performances are reserved, carefully and meticulously executed in the most efficient and aesthetically pleasing arrangement you could imagine, interlocking and falling distant again until they either dissipate or build to some visceral conclusion. There's been a few wholly instrumental albums I've fallen deeply in love with this year, and this is one of the ones I feel the most passionate about, because I feel that it conveys the same amount of passion back into the listener. This is a beautiful album not to be missed. And at number 22, we have another passionate instrumental album, though it's one I feel a lot less joy experiencing. That's the new, titleless Godspeed You! Black Emperor record. My own relationship with Godspeed is well documented on this channel. They are very likely my favorite band. What has made them such a special group to me has always been the fearlessness and virtue with which they tackle the global landscape of the time their music emerges from, frequently evoking a very real and tangible political message with few or no words, and creating the soundtracks to the hopeful future revolutions that will come to meet the oppressive forces they play against. This year, then, I was fully expecting and somewhat dreading the inevitable release of an album that tackled the still ongoing genocide taking place in Gaza at the hand of Israel's military, a military that both the American and Canadian government have dedicated themselves to supporting financially using public tax dollars. Coming into this record, which in lieu of a title instead displays the civilian death toll as of February 13th this past year, I was expecting an angry, rage-fueled record. I was expecting aggression and sorrow akin to what I have been constantly feeling as I am repeatedly forced to come to terms with this massacre. What I got instead was somehow even more devastating. This is a record with a lot of vitriol and rightful anger, but more than that, it's a record filled to the brim with hope, humanity, and life. The life-affirming nature of the music here stands in stark contrast to all of the imagery we've spent over a year bearing witness to, a tribute to the lives lost and to the lives that will inevitably remain after all is said and done. the green shoots that will emerge from the gray rubble of a broken but freed Palestine. The music itself happens to be the best thing they've done in almost a quarter century, but through the lens of its subject matter, it comes out as probably the most impactful and important release of their whole career. This is not the last album about Palestine you'll see on this list, but it's the one I think most people will be able to properly access and acknowledge. Next, at number 21, is the only EP on my whole list, and that's the self-titled by I Will Be Pretty When I Die. This is a collaboration between Gustavo Nome of Ginger Bee fame, I guess, and Goth Lipstick, and it's 15 minutes of just the prettiest, softest indie folk you'll ever hear. Just absolutely perfect stuff that really touches the soul, and then rips it out as it bleeds into something much heavier and louder, but no less heartfelt and crushing. There's not a lot to say here since it's such a short and simple release, but its simplicity is what makes it so excellent, and its brevity leaves literally no room for error. There is no reason not to check this one out. And now at number 20, let's talk about the new Kamasi Washington album, Fearless Movement. One of, if not the biggest jazz legend to come out of this century, Kamasi has made a huge name for himself in the 2010s with two of the grandest, most expansive records to come out of the genre in a long time, as well as with a host of excellent collaborations with artists such as Kendrick Lamar, Run the Jewels, Thundercat, and Flying Lotus. Moving into the 2020s, it was inevitable that we'd get another record from him, but we waited a fair while before it finally emerged. Fearless Movement is that record, and for my money, it's the best thing he's ever put his name to. Relatively scant for him at only 90 minutes, this album sees him branching out from his more defined spiritual sound and incorporating more funk and fusion elements, as well as a wide array of features such as a flute-playing Andre 3000, the aforementioned Thundercat, and the grandfather of P-Funk himself, George Clinton. The result is his most varied and propulsive work to date, with not a moment of excess or fat to trim throughout, feeling like a grand celebration of the current state of jazz, soul, and funk music through the lens of old souls and new contemporaries. On the tracks without features, we get to see Kamasi take center stage and demonstrate exactly why he's the name that comes to mind first when we talk about 21st century jazz musicians. His saxophone playing is legendary as always, but even more impressive is the way he's able to conduct his new band through genres and sounds we haven't heard him tackle before, and he flies through each one with flying colors and a clear passion that comes through in the music with every solo, every rhythm section, every arrangement. In that sense, this is still just as spiritual as any of his previous works, just a truly liberating experience that I implore you to set this time aside for. Next, for number 19, I want to put you guys on to an artist named Audrey, with the 6th of 7 albums she's put out this year, called Twice. If there's one thing that every one of Audrey's many, many projects excels at, it's cultivating a mood, a vibe, an emotion. Previous records of hers that I've heard, like More Stretched by the Curtain and Undisclosed Advertising and End Credits, did this through incredibly glitchy, lo-fi experimental rock and slowcore, evoking this deeply unnerving melancholy in the listener. On Twice, that melancholy is still at the forefront, but the way she goes about creating it is instead through very noisy, compressed post-rock and dream pop, even shoegaze at times. The elements are often deceptively simple, usually just a drum machine, a single guitar, and some kind of synth or noise element, and yet with those very limited tools, she's able to craft such a universal and yet singular tone, one that I can't recall any specific piece of music capturing before, and yet one that I can't imagine any of you will hear and not innately get. For me, it takes me right back to the midnight walks I would take during COVID that I frequently mention on this channel. Without directly sounding like anything I heard at that stage in my life, there's a deep personal connection I feel with this music in a way that I don't think I've ever gotten from a new release to this point. This, to my ears, is the best sonic world Audrey has yet crafted, and it places her squarely in the upper echelon of this growing scene of Bandcamp artists who release new albums every 18 seconds. And while I've got your mind on the number 18, let's shift your attention to another Bandcamp-only release as my number 18 spot, Harry Gorski Brown's sole musical release up to this point, titled Dirt Drone Maker After Dreamboats. In general, I think online music tastes are way too Euro and American-centric, often ignoring the greater global arts scenes when we're in search of new great music. But even within that Euro label, I think often we only think about certain regions and cultures. In metal, it's often Norway, Sweden, and Finland we talk about. In electronic music, it's Germany, and in basically every other scene, it's basically just Britain. Awfully little attention gets paid to the rich and distinct regional sounds of countries like Ireland and Scotland, often getting drowned out in favor of the broader label of the United Kingdom. Last year, Irish folk music managed to get a breakout success in the form of Lankum's excellent release, and this year, I want to do my part to help spread the word for the Scottish. Harry Gorski Brown is an artist who seems to have made it his mission on this project to bring new life to an assortment of traditional Scottish Gaelic folk tunes through the filter of modern avant-garde artistry, both musically and visually by way of a short accompanying film on his website. The album uses a range of tape distortion, lo-fi production techniques, and drones to revitalize and recontextualize these traditional works into something wholly unique, and yet wishfully nostalgic at the same time. There's a wonderfully endearing amateurishness to the whole thing, which only serves to enhance its beauty as the flaws in the recordings and performances bring to the forefront the raw and human connection to these pieces. It's hypnotic in a way that nothing else truly is, extracting the drone at the core of the bagpipe and applying it to a new framework, exploring new ideas and worlds with it. Expand your musical horizons and give this piece a listen. You'll be better for it. Next up in my 17th spot is the new album from UK rapper Gao the Arsonist, And They Mine for Our Bodies. I only discovered this artist very recently when Ggavara posted online about opening for him this month, and wow, am I ever glad I decided to give him a listen. Gao has one of the most captivating mic presences I've heard this year, flipping between rapping, shouting, and singing with ease and grace that makes him impossible to ignore, filling a very similar niche vocally to someone like Quedeca's recent material, but with a more laser-focused artistic vision behind that voice. The make or break element for a lot of people is going to be the mix on this thing, and luckily for me, it is absolutely a make. Lo-fi doesn't even properly convey it, it's more so low bit, completely compressed and bit crushed into oblivion to the point where 90% of the time the lyrics are unintelligible, but that rawness and brick wall effect makes these instrumentals hit even harder for me, and the intangibility of the vocals makes their content seem alien and unattainable, like I'm grasping at an artistic vision I can never truly access. It makes it so every time I am able to put my finger on a line or a lyric, it sticks out so much more and imprints on my brain that much easier. The instrumentals on this thing are also so cool, flipping at a whim between witch house, cloud rap, jazz samples, industrial and metal-infused trap beats, pure synthy noise like on the track Insomnia, or chopped up vocal samples like on Do As I Say. This isn't Gao's first project, in fact, it seems to be a direct companion to a much shorter project in 2022, but this feels like the moment where he's finally realized his artistic potential, and I can't wait to see where his sound evolves from here. Next, at number 16, is an artist we've been waiting more than 15 years to hear from again, Beth Gibbons, with her new solo album, Lives Outgrown. There's a very real possibility that Portishead's album, Dummy, is my favorite album of all time, and the self-titled and third are not far behind. So it's always been a bit of a sore spot for me that I wasn't really actively conscious of music at the time where the band was releasing music. A few years ago, the aforementioned frontwoman made a surprise guest appearance on Kendrick Lamar's album on what is handily the most powerful track on that record, which tipped us off that she might be making a return to music, but it was still a surprise when Lives Outgrown was announced and then subsequently released in May this year. With such a long gap between this and the last time we'd heard her voice in music, this album really could have sounded like anything, and yet what it came out as is something pretty wholly unique to her. There is not a whole lot of albums or music you could directly compare this album to without coming off as reductive, even considering the relatively stripped back and simple presentation. The first thing that came to mind for me is late era Talk Talk, which isn't too surprising considering her only album under her own name was a collaboration with a member of that band. But in general, I think this album is filling an otherwise untapped sound within contemporary folk music and chamber music generally. There is no end to how warm and intimate this record feels, and while it is certainly a rhythmic album, it's not rhythmic in the same rigid and hypnotic way Portishead was. Instead, it's a very loose and tom-heavy album, which lends it a feeling more akin to classical music than anything else. Gibbons' voice has also aged about as well as you could possibly imagine. Her voice always sounded decades removed from its recordings in the 90s, but here, that smoky, jazz-style timbre has only grown more effective as the real person behind that voice has aged to meet where her voice always was. That age is a core theme of the record, and more broadly, time as a concept, whether it be mortality both on an interpersonal and global level, or the contrast of age between her voice and the children's choir on Floating on a Moment, or the romantic string sections that play alongside blaring distorted guitars. This whole record feels like a very personal artistic statement. For someone as reclusive and private as Beth Gibbons to put out something this emotionally impacted, it holds an immense gravity that is impossible to ignore. This is the perfect encapsulation of what makes Beth Gibbons an essential part of the music landscape. This album could not have been made by another person, and it could never have been made at any time except right now. Following that, at number 15, is another tiny Bandcamp artist I want to introduce you to, and that's the group Deep Fade with their album Line of Flight. This thing has only been bought 13 times according to Bandcamp, and if we can even double that small number, I feel like I've succeeded with this video. The music itself is just about the best fusion of noise, drone, and industrial I've ever heard, with real-world samples of construction and demolition sites, as well as manufacturing plants being utterly consumed by tape noise, a sea of synthetic distortion, light melodic elements, and the hauntingly beautiful hums and whispers of one Amanda Vada, the original mastermind behind this project. Crashing, drawn-out mechanical rhythms pepper the project, a little bit here and a little bit there, and blaring noise and buzzing synths will frequently smash through, but a large swath of this record is relegated to a distant, ominous void of hiss, oscillating in tone and volume to disorient and destabilize the listener, forcing a degree of attention even in a genre that otherwise often fades into the background. This void lies relentlessly between the sounds of labor, of underserved workers maintaining a machine that will not remember them when they are gone, and who, even in this recording, are simply tools to further a creation that they cannot benefit from. Even in all of this, nature can be felt, as the birds on the album cover or the river whose sample is heard on track 1, they too will fall victim to the industry that allowed, or it should be said forced, this art to be created. This album is a document of these things that will eventually be forgotten in the fleeting memory of time, or transformed and transfigured to be unrecognizable from the states we see and hear now. This fragmented experience will live on with the few who get to hear it, and I feel compelled to ensure that more people experience it than would otherwise. For my number 14 pick, we unfortunately stick to the theme of mortality as we talk about the tragically final Ka album, The Thief Next to Jesus. There is a deeply analytical lens through which one could talk about this album and its themes, especially in light of Ka's untimely passing at only 52 years old. The album certainly warrants that degree of study and discussion, but my personal attachment to this album comes from a much more emotional place, a borderline spiritual bond. Ka has been one of my favorite rappers for a very long time. I think his weathered, grounded delivery, combined with some of the most measured pen game and lyricism in the underground, helped him stand out, and his real-life experiences had clearly given him an angle that nobody else could mimic. When this album was released, I was excited for it, but didn't get to it right away, and as time went on, and critical acclaim began to pile high, I started to get intimidated. Ka's best works always take a heavy focus and a fair number of repeated listens to grasp, and with a not insignificant amount of his fanbase declaring this as his best, I needed to set aside some time to properly sit with it and let it mull over in my head. That time didn't come until mid-October, when I finally decided to suck it up and listen, and in a turn of events that I can only describe as a sick twist of fate, right as I was listening to the track Broken Rose Window, track 6, I got news that Ka had passed away. I don't even really remember what the rest of that initial listen to the album was like. I was heartbroken, of course, but more than that, I was shook to the core by the divine tragedy of it all. It took me a few weeks before I was ready to listen to the album again, and hearing it now in the context of what has happened, the themes of this record became even more devastating than they already would have been on release. This is an album that deeply confronts Christianity and the hollowness of religion in the face of true faith, and coming to terms with that faith when the religion whose God you worship is inarguably the source of so much worldwide trauma. It's an album that is drowning in spiritual turmoil, an album that leaves every question open with no definitive answers, because at the end of the day, we on Earth can never truly know. It's the album I had always wanted Ka to make. It's a degree of artistic vulnerability and mastery that only a scarce few will ever attain, and while I would trade this album's existence for Ka's life in a heartbeat, there's something cosmically appropriate about this being his final album. Wherever he is now, I hope he found the answers he was looking for. Rest in peace, Ka. There will never be another like you. There's really no clean way to transition out of that without it being jarring, so my apologies for that, but here we go. At number 13, I want to give some attention to the album Leaving Zilent Trodden by LXT. This is a collaboration between artists Janice Lago and Roxy Radcliffe, both of whom I've been fans of prior, but I can't say I ever expected them to do a full album together. Janice's stuff is pretty industrial electronic leaning with a lot of IDM and deconstructed club stuff going on through her nearly 200 releases to date. Roxy, on the other hand, while obviously incredibly experimental, often leans a lot more towards, I guess, pop music. All of this is relative, of course, but Roxy's stuff leans a lot more into EDM and hyperpop trappings in a lot of what I've heard from her, and even the stuff that isn't is at least playing with genres that are tangentially accessible. So, when these two forces combine, what do we get? Well, I'll just let the genre tags on Rate Your Music speak for themselves. So, yeah, this is one of the most unique pieces of music ever, obviously, just from looking at the list of influences, but plenty of wild and bizarre genre fusions have come and gone as proofs of concept or gimmicks rather than actually compelling artistic works in and of themselves. That's what's so fascinating about LXT as a project. Because of the two very distinct angles that Janice and Roxy are coming from, we see a distinct mastery of drone and industrial structures and soundscapes from the former, and an unmatched understanding of the textures of dubstep thanks to the latter. Neither artist has ever boxed themselves into one sound, which lends an open-mindedness and drive to explore that allows for such great artistic chemistry and a perfect fusion of those disparate angles. These 4 10-plus minute tracks make incredible use of the varied textures available through Skrillex and Nero-style brostep, and draws those sounds, usually relegated to short stabs and peaks, out to their most abstract, dilapidated conclusions. Through this ocean of electronic noise, melodies can be found, both constructed and accidental, and each one builds up the musical core that drives this record through its various conclusions. It's a wave of hypnosis that begs to be listened to on the best headphones money can buy, to really allow the detail and intricacies of digital sound to sink in and get under your skin. There has never been music that sounded like this, and I can only hope that LXT continues to make music together and explore the wide ocean they've discovered. Next up at number 12 is an album that earlier in the year was actually my number 1, which says nothing about this thing growing off me and everything about how unmatched a year this was for music. Coming out in early January, Accelero by Brazilian experimental rap group Krisen The Zedo immediately blew me away and kept me addicted for months to follow. Back when I talked about it on Modulation, I ended the discussion by saying I was confident that it would be landing in the top 5 of the year, and if 2024 had been a normal year, it absolutely would have been. But I'll say it again, and I've said it before, this is the best year for music of my entire lifetime. What makes this project so special for me is the fact that in a world where industrial hip-hop seems mostly to have devolved into Death Grip's worship, Accelero is drawing from a completely different, totally unique range of influences to come to a similar but ultimately distinct conclusion. The record seems to be playing in the same ballpark as other underground Brazilian electronic innovators like DJ Ramon Sucesso and Cabeça de Nengo. But even for as much as I adore those projects, this feels like a more developed sound, one that is drawing in sounds and ideas that I rarely hear in music, and especially not to this degree of mastery. In a lot of ways, I would consider this record to be a stylistic successor to MIA's Maya record, which shows not only how ahead of its time that album was, but also how many traditionally Latin and Brazilian music elements the group is combining with more contemporary electronic music of our time. The record also manages to maintain this oxymoronic sense of being both chill and invigorating simultaneously, with chaotic, unpredictable instrumentals contrasted against these laid-back, husky vocals that, rather than subtracting energy from the production, instead add an extra cool factor on top of everything. The track-to-track flow helps with this, with insane rap metal tracks, one of which features Sepultura drummer Igor Cavalera, bleeding perfectly into laid-back melodic tracks and back into crazy dance party tracks like Simulado. There's a palpable push and pull on this record between energy and vibes, with each track containing both of those core elements, but where those lines cross on each one varies in really compelling ways. I love this album a whole lot, and I hope that the group continues down this road because I think they've got something really special here. Next up is another dissonant death metal album, and for my money, the absolute best of the year, that being Ulcerate's Cutting the Throat of God at number 11. Despite the fact that metal was kind of my first love in music, and for as big a fan I am of it, I've found myself getting pickier and pickier as time goes on. It's a genre with such a massive range of possibilities, and yet often I find myself at least a little disappointed with the direction bands choose to go in. Death metal especially is a genre that, when it's at its peak, is my absolute favorite subgenre, but so much of it boils down to just being generic for me. With that being the case, it's always a treat when a death metal album really steps up to the plate with something special to say and lands a home run on execution, and Ulcerate's 7th studio album is that home run. What I immediately latched onto with this thing is the production. I heard and really enjoyed their previous record, 2020's Stare Into Death and Be Still, but I struggled pretty badly with the way that record actually sounded, finding it to be slushy and muted, rolling right off my ears on impact, and dulling the effect of the riffs and songwriting. This record, though, sounds enormous. There's so much space in the recording, allowing all of the band's complicated and layered instrumentals to breathe and sing without coming off as pristine or shiny. There's a grime here, akin to their earlier records like Vermis, but while maintaining the atmosphere and twisted melody that their last record excelled at. The other big thing with this album that pushed it above and beyond my expectations was the songwriting. You know a death metal album is good when songwriting is a point of pride to be acknowledged. Every riff and passage here is the absolute peak of the genre, but more than that, they're sequenced and interwoven in such a seamless and propulsive way that it'd be impossible to fall out of step with it, and frequently, riffs and melodies will return or be reworked later in these songs to unbelievably satisfying effect. It almost feels economical, the measured placement and usage of tempo and riff changes constantly shifting at the perfect moments, never ousting the atmospheric elements, but never leaving them stagnant enough to become long-winded. There is an argument to be made for this as my favorite death metal album ever. It's that good, and at the very least, it's the best thing the genre has done since Gorguts' Colored Sands back in 2013. We are blessed to have a band this good still putting out top-of-the-line material at this point. Next up, bringing us into the top 10 is one of my biggest surprises of the year, even though it really shouldn't have been, and that's the new Elucid album, Revelator. If you know my taste, you know that I am a huge fan of Billy Woods and Armand Hammer, but I will fully admit to you now that up until last year's Diabetic Test Strips album, I had been underrating and ignoring how important an artistic voice Elucid was in the group. Because of that, I was excited for this album, but still unsure of what direction and what level of quality was in store for us. Immediately upon listening, though, it was clear that not only was this a masterpiece, but it stands alone as a uniquely genius album, and is easily one of the best Armand Hammer adjacent works, hands down. To start with, this is one of the most absurdly difficult and disorienting rap albums of recent memory, and it's absolutely genius for it, diving headfirst into some of the harshest and most obscure sounds I've ever heard an established artist tackle. There's so much noise, old school industrial, dark ambient, and blitzkrieg rhythmic attacks all over this thing, and somehow, Elucid is able to flow perfectly on every single one without seemingly ever breaking a sweat. An instrumental version of this record, if it were to exist, would stand alone as a wildly experimental piece of music, and I don't think I would have ever been able to imagine a pocket for someone to rap over 90% of these tracks, but Elucid has such a commanding presence that it feels like he's excavating a pocket where none existed and making it work around him perfectly. Whether it be the frantic tempo of the double kick pedal on CCTV, or the utter lack of a time signature or steady tempo on the following Slum of a Disregard, somehow it all sounds natural to him, like this is just what he was made for. What made this record fully click for me was hearing that it was directly inspired by Miles Davis's song Rated X off my favorite jazz album of all time, Get Up With It. If you haven't listened to the song or album, I implore you to go do that. It's one of the most unhinged things to come out of any decade, let alone the 70s. Davis invented Aphex Twin when Richard D. James was only 3 years old. Through the lens of this track, it's impossible not to feel an immense kinship between Elucid and Davis, two artistic visionaries of different times cyclically feeding into each other across genre and decade. It makes me wonder, because I would consider this album to be equally ahead of its time as Davis's works in the 70s, so 50 years from now, what will the music inspired by Revelator sound like? It's an exciting time to be alive, and if there is any justice in the world, history will not forget this album. On the topic of things history must never forget, our number 9 record is the debut from Michigan-based noise rock band Prostitute, Attempted Martyr. Dedicated to Lebanon and those martyred in the ongoing offensive campaign by so-called Israel, this band made it their mission, on their first record, to adequately represent the turmoil of what the world would like to call a conflict, but that anyone with eyes knows the real word for. The result is the most visceral, unkempt, perfect noise rock album this decade, and, for my money, a contender for the best the genre has to offer this century. This was a late discovery for me in the year. In fact, I was well over halfway through writing the script when I discovered it, so I had to do some very serious rearranging. But I'm very glad I did, because this album is special in ways that only a debut record from a band with something to say and rigid constraints to work within can be. Mo's vocals on this thing are the most viscerally angry I've heard all year, a desperate war cry full of righteous vitriol and rage, human in essence, but animalistic in substance, delivering spiteful and pained screeds that contain some of the most evocative poetry I've yet seen on the subject, chilling to the bone and only enhanced by the voice of someone who, like all of us, has seen more death this year than a just world would allow in a whole lifetime. The music behind him, then, matches the vocals at every step. Twisted, corroded guitar lines generate a ceaseless barrage of piercing noise under which urgent drums and irresistible bass grooves drag the listener forward into the gaping maw of hell. Even more so than most noise rock, this thing takes heavy influence from post-punk in its construction and song structuring, but while there are melodies and moments that tone down the aggression slightly, There is no actual respite, as each keyboard section and guitar line still soaks in the blood of the musical massacres that came before, and no scabs can fully cover the wounds repeatedly inflicted on this thing. Prostitute is the band I am most looking forward to following into the future, and Attempted Martyr is hands down the best debut we've seen this year, an essential, unflinching cry of distress that demands to be heard and paid its full dues. Bear witness as the new big thing in noise rock is born in front of our eyes. Next up for number 8 is an album that kind of goes against why I make these lists, but that's okay. Asleep Country is a project I've talked about before on this channel in my 2022 best of list, but with Lux, ostensibly Octa's final work under this name, they really pulled out all the stops in every sense of the phrase. When I'm making these lists, the main thing I'm trying to accomplish is to get someone, even one person from my audience, to check out these albums. I don't do reviews in any traditional sense, so this is my main outlet to show people albums they might have missed in the mess of albums we have to filter through year after year. With this album, though, I'm not convinced that any of you will go listen to this at my recommendation, or would ever listen to it under any circumstances, and that's because Lux, as the ultimate culmination of everything Sleep Country has worked for up to this point, is 8.5 hours long. This is the longest cohesive piece of music I've ever made it through. It took 2 sittings. I started to get too tired and drift to sleep around the 5 or 6 hour mark, but I did it, and honestly, I think this album could not have been any shorter. The amount being achieved in this vast time span, hitting upon so many different aesthetics but still maintaining a strict and unwavering artistic identity and keeping up momentum across 28 tracks, almost none of which fall below the 15-minute mark, it's the kind of thing that just doesn't happen. There was a very clear vision guiding this whole project, and for as staggering and monolithic as its runtime is, I would not be able to pinpoint any bloat for you if I tried. Describing the actual music at play here is deceptively difficult, because most of these tracks use repeated and upcycled elements for a majority of the runtime, but the feeling these collaged sounds evoke is consistently unlike anything I've ever felt in different ways for every piece of this massive puzzle. In general, I would describe the sounds here to be a vast interwoven collection of electronic sounds and pulled apart samples, constructed and layered into an intangible liquid mass of musical ideas that build and never seem to dissipate, widening constantly as they adopt glitch, ambient, electroacoustic, psychedelia, and industrial into their weave. Even more impressive is the fact that all of this feels deliberately constructed. It would be easier, though still incredibly difficult, to pull together 8.5 hours of improvised and jammed out material, but every decision across this record feels purposeful and mandatory for the rest of the album, and ultimately, the necessity of this piece feels self-evident. This album had to be made, and this is how it had to be made. It's an experience I can't in good faith expect anyone else to be willing or able to put the time aside for, but this is my list, and this is one of the most incredible pieces of music released this year. Next, at number 7, maybe a little bit more accessible and one I'm sure most of you have already heard, I have the latest Magdalena Bay album, Imaginal Disc. Man, I am fully locked in with this band. If you're a longtime viewer of mine, you might remember that I placed their debut record, Mercurial World, incredibly high on my best albums of 2021 list as my number 3, and with this new album, I think they have almost inarguably outpaced themselves by miles. It's been such a delight to watch a band that I was a fan of when they were not necessarily niche, but were mostly relegated to online music spaces, exploding in popularity and flourishing based pretty much entirely on the quality of their work. Every song on this thing is absolute pop bliss, hitting a massive variety of sounds on every track, whether it be Killing Time, which is the best Steely Dan song in 40 years, the proggy masterpiece that is Death and Romance, the glitchy and jittery chill wave of Fear Sex, or the irresistibly groovy That's My Floor. There's not a single weak link in this track list, and it never strays too far from the core sound that Magdalena Bay have carved out for themselves here. The record feels super exploratory, like a deep dive into the mind of what makes pop music tick, and yet its structure is unfalteringly driving, with not a second of fluff on the whole thing, interlude included. What really sets the album head and shoulder above pretty much everything else released this year, though, especially in the realm of pop, is the production. So many intricacies, so many details layered over every moment, and yet it never feels bloated or obtuse. It just feels like this much stuff is the bare minimum required to properly convey what it wants to. Mika's voice, as always, is utterly captivating, with a real witchy, vocal fry heavy coo that makes the music work the way it does, and here I think we see her best vocal performances ever by a landslide, taking on so many difficult melodic lines and bits of vocal flair without flinching for a second, even as the chord progressions she's writing over get more and more fascinating and unconventional. On the whole, this is another knockout blow from Magdalena Bay, who I am just about ready to declare as the best band of the 2020s. I saw them a couple years back for a 20-minute set at 2 p.m. at a festival, and that's still one of the best shows I've ever seen. I cannot wait to see what they do with this album and a full headliner set next year. Next, at number 6, we have to talk about the new album by Mount Eerie, Night Palace. When Phil Elevrum released The Microphones in 2020, back in, 2020, there was a part of me that wondered if that was his quiet farewell. It was an incredibly retrospective album in nature, and in a lot of ways felt like the perfect conclusion to his musical story. The guy's getting older, he's got a kid to take care of, especially as a single father, and so when we had radio silence after that album, I came to accept that there was a good chance he'd just fade into the background, having said what he wanted to as one of the most prolific artists of the 2000s and 2010s. Now that I've been proven wrong, though, I couldn't be happier, because I'm just gonna say it, this is, by a landslide, the best thing he's done in 20 years. It's difficult for me to put into words what makes Night Palace such a perfect album, in a similar way that all of Phil's best work evades description. It's music that, for as soft and reserved a demeanor he has, insists on itself in a way that makes it feel reductive to try and boil it down and describe it rather than just listening to it. No two songs on this album sound alike, and yet there's a mood and tone draped across it that feels even more cohesive than if the sound was more uniform and consistent. Lo-fi recordings are placed directly alongside the most clear and pristine sounding music he's ever released. There's noise, there's field recordings, there's black metal, and in general, I would say that every good idea Phil has ever had on previous albums appear here in some form, brought up to their fullest potential in a package I would describe, without hesitation, as flawless. The emotional core of this record is what really sets it above and beyond for me, because for as much as I love the straightforward raw pain on display on A Crow Looked at Me, even that doesn't give me the same feelings that this, Glow Part 2, and Mount Eerie give me, which is, I'm crying and I don't understand why. Given enough listens, I predict that I will eventually cry to every single track here at least once, and I'll never be able to articulate why that is. The connection I have to these records is one I could only describe as a spiritual bond, a dangerously fragile but immensely powerful link between art, artist, and listener that exceptionally few manage to establish, and even fewer manage to maintain. Music doesn't get much better than this. Next up, kicking off the top 5, we have the Willie Carlisle album Critterland, which for me was the punch in the gut that told me that this year was going to be something special right from the start. I've been doing my best over the past 2 years to fully get into country music, to try and dispel within myself the notion that it's any lesser a genre than the ones I grew up around or got into as a teenager. It's been one of the most fulfilling projects I've ever undertaken, one I highly recommend anyone in my audience take up, because genuinely, some of the greatest music ever written is country music, and I think checking this album out would be a great place to start. Queer country has been getting a lot more attention in recent years, first with the mainstream explosion of Orville Peck, but also with people like Adim the Artist carving a space for themselves. And for my money, Willie Carlisle is the best in the scene right now, the ultimate culmination of every gay cowboy who's picked up a guitar since Lavender Country in the 70s. I was talking earlier in the year with fellow YouTuber Lily Alexander about this album, and she said something that has never left my mind. Pete Seeger has been reincarnated, and he's singing about sucking cock. What this album will live or die on is its lyricism, and whether its imagery works for you, and for me, the answer is an unequivocal and ecstatic yes. From the first track, there's an immediate passion on display. Critterland sets out the core metaphors of the project beautifully. When we talk about music as primal or animalistic, frequently it's when talking about aggressive, unbound, dangerous music. But this title track serves to remind us of the other side of mammals, which is an unwavering dedication to survival and to protecting their kin. The sparrow on the wing taught me to fight for you, and the possum keeps her teeth sharper than I do. A later track, Two-Headed Lamb, pulls the animal angle deeper, delivering a heart-wrenching story over a dirge that makes it impossible not to follow, and Jaybird follows later with a soul-rending narrative of finding hope in the hopeless, with the standout line of the whole album, "It's no surprise your body was never found. I find your body all over this town." There's so much to talk about with this record, from the variety of sounds across the instrumentals here, the reverence for the working class music that sits at the heart of all Americana, to the several surprise tracks and ideas that I'll leave for you to discover. But I just want to say that this is a special piece of music from a special, special artist. I saw Carlisle back in May of this year, and genuinely, talking to him after the show was the nicest interaction I've ever had with a musician. He seems to be a massive sweetheart, and it shows in his music. I can't wait to see him again. Next, at number 4, is the new album from one of my favorite bands ever, and that's Shushu with 13-inch Frank Beltrame Italian stiletto with bison horn grips. Watching Shushu's progression has been so fascinating, seeing them oscillate between super obtuse and super accessible, with neither side of the equation ever truly overpowering the other. On this new record, I think the band has struck their most perfect balance yet, with what is easily their most digestible album since Forget in 2017, and simultaneously their most emotionally evocative since The Air Force or La Forêt in 2006 or 2005. It's so musically dense and chaotic, but the elements that are being smashed together come out sounding much more like an evil MGMT than any of their previous cursed sounds on projects like Ignore Grief or Girl with Basket of Fruit. On a production level, this thing is absolutely nuts. The first single, Common Loon, tipped us off to this with what is essentially a standard synthpop instrumental palette, but blown up and out to such immense proportions that it becomes unrecognizable. In typical Shushu fashion, Jamie Stewart's hushed vocals are mixed right up high, often just sitting atop the rest of the instrumentals. But on this album, they also get buried a lot more than usual, interweaving constantly with the instrumentals in an incredibly satisfying way. The songwriting on the album covers a wide variety of structures, as is to be expected from the band, but I wouldn't say there's a single thing they do here that they don't absolutely nail. Opening track Arp Omni revives the ambient vocal track style of something like Ian Curtis' Wishlist. Pale Flower has this really engrossing simultaneous rigidity and lack of structure that culminates in such a gratifying way, and the combined synth and guitar leads on Beneficium are absolute ear candy, aided by the unmatched drum performance of one David Kendrick, who, funnily enough, was the touring drummer for bands like Devo and Sparks. That drumming culminates perfectly on the final track, which, in the best way, invokes Trilogy-era Swans the way it flips between visceral grooves and languid soundscapes, and the vocal performance, which I would put right up there as Stewart's best. I don't think Shushu has ever released a bad or even mid album, but it has felt like they've been trying to find their footing since 2019. Albums released since then have been solid, but I think this album finally gets it, and fully recaptures what made Shushu such a magical project to begin with. It's the best thing they've done in 20 years, and it's absolutely phenomenal. At number 3 is an album that's been a little bit of a point of pride for me this year, and that's the album by Sam LRC titled A Lonely Sinner. This album has blown up a lot in the months since its release, and rightfully so, but when I listened to this, it had 30 ratings on Rate Your Music and about 12 monthly listeners on Spotify, so that's my little hipster badge out of the way. This is one of the most fascinating and powerful post-rock albums I've heard in a long, long time. What's immediately mind-blowing is the fact that this thing sounds absolutely immaculate. This was made in some kid from Brazil's bedroom, and yet it sounds better than a vast majority of major studio recordings I listen to on a weekly basis. There's such a vast dynamic range across the whole album, and while it does stay pretty steadily within the broader realm of post-rock, the sonic range on this thing is nothing short of astounding, and every idea attempted across the album goes off seemingly without a hitch. Each song on this album has at least one moment that floored me and left me mouth wide open thinking, there's no way she just did that. And every time, without fail, she did in fact just do that. Maybe it's the rhythmic build in the back half of Philosophy, the build on Sinner, the unbelievable mastery of sampling and mashup on 4M, or the straight up Parannoul track that is Sheep Theme. Storage is the far and away highlight here though. At first building up like the heaviest Godspeed track that Godspeed never made, building and building until it seems like there's nowhere else to possibly go, before erupting into the biggest riff in the whole world. This is a full-on Cult of Luna level of heft and dissonance, and this part of the song is so detailed, especially the drum patterns, which display such a clear understanding and familiarity with what makes sludge metal work, and yet it's only used for this brief segment, because any more would devalue it and the rest of the music surrounding it. There's an analogy I made when talking about this album on my podcast that I want to recount here, because I was really proud of it at the time. When this album came out, my partner and I were in the middle of watching Netflix's competitive glass-blowing show, Blown Away. In it, there was a competitor named Jonathan who would constantly push out these pieces that simply should not work within his time constraints. Pieces that are either too huge or too complex or too risky to safely execute. Half the time, while he's making them, one of the parts or even the whole thing will crack or shatter, and yet somehow, he pulls it back in at the last minute to feel intentional and even greater than the original plan. That's what this album feels like to me. Like Sam had a vision in mind from the beginning, one way greater than any of her many constraints or limitations should reasonably allow, and yet by sheer force of ambition and determination, it all comes together as something as good as or better than that original artistic vision. She deserves all of the accolades and more, and I'm anxious to see whatever she puts out next. Coming up on the end of the list, we follow with my number 2 pick of the year, the album that I have been anticipating for the better part of 5 years, Impossible Light by Yuboa. I've made my thoughts on her last album, The Origin of My Depression, well known. It was one of my very first experiences with truly inaccessible music, and it's not an exaggeration to say that that album changed my life forever. It's what made me realize that I wanted to write about art, and one of the things that made me understand the personal impact that music could have if you really give yourself over and let it make you feel things, even things you would otherwise avoid. After that record, we got the fantastic Flesh of the World EP, a marginally more accessible but no less impactful record that dove more into synth and dark wave. Then there was a collaboration with Teeth Dreams, which unfortunately no one seems to have listened to, and now this. Impossible Light is an almost immeasurably good album. It's the culmination of everything that Yuboa has stood for the past 6 or so years, and feels like her ultimate artistic achievement up to this point. It perfectly combines the noise of The Sky May Be, the ambient death industrial of Origin, and the synthier tendencies of Flesh of the World into one behemoth of an album that stands uniquely tall in the company of her other masterpieces. What has always enamored me towards Yuboa's music is the clear balance being struck between deliberation and chaos. Elements of even the noisiest and most abrasive tracks are rigid and direct, and for every predictably sequenced section, there's always a backhand of noise and discord. Here on Impossible Light, I think that has never been more true. This album has been in the works since 2018, according to Xandra, and that's extremely clear in how ambitious and grand a statement it is. But for an album that long in the oven, the miracle is in the fact that it never comes off as overbearing. The soundscapes are lush and complex without ever losing focus or drifting into sloppy territory. It's a very measured, smart use of resources and time available that never ceases to amaze me. Each track on the album feels essential, and the piece is bursting at the seams with amazing, incredible songs. Endocrine Disruptor is a straight-up industrial rock song with fantastic singing and an incredible sequenced keyboard melody, which then implodes on itself, revealing a post-rock crescendo that would fit in perfectly alongside the greats. Gordian Worm is a truly haunted piece of music with that repeated synth bass jab tying together a disarray of sounds until it eventually evolves into a straight-up djent song that wouldn't feel too out of place in the next Doom game. Yuboa also continues her trend of having an absolutely incredible penultimate track before a 10-minute closer, in this case with the gorgeous and layered Sleep Hygiene leading into the unbelievable Impossible Light Golden Flower, which features Ote Oni as well as Ravenna Hunt Hendricks of Liturgy fame on vocals. The sound of this track is a lot like something off of Bjork's Vespertine, which, considering that album is in the running for my favorite ever, is one of the biggest compliments you could give. It breathes and sways across its runtime before coming to a conclusion so utterly perfect that I can't possibly imagine another end. Impossible Light is perfect. It's a masterpiece that perfectly encapsulates everything that Yuboa is as a project and builds upon everything she's established up to this point. It's not as devastating as Origin or as catchy as Flesh. It doesn't replace either record for me, but it does something even better by acting as a convergence point between those two opuses and creating a new, brighter trail for her to blaze going forward. And finally, my number one album of the year. The best album from the best year of music I've been alive for. And you know what? It's not even really an album. I'm talking about Archivos de Radio Piedras, the radio drama released by Nicholas Yar back in April. I put listening to this off for a very, very long time, but when I finally got around to it, there was no denying what it was. The greatest piece of art this decade has yet offered us. Now, why did I put it off so long? Well, remember how inaccessible that Asleep Country album was, the one I was talking about earlier that's 8 hours long? Well, this is somehow even less accessible. Now, it's not nearly as long, at only 3.5 hours, but what makes Archivos so difficult, nearly impossible to recommend, is the fact that for the entire time, you have to be reading along to a translated transcript of the drama because it's delivered entirely in Spanish and Arabic. That makes it more of an investment than watching Seven Samurai, for reference, and by a fair bit too, because Archivos de Radio Piedras is one of the most densely packed, interreferential, and laborious pieces of art you're likely to experience this year if you choose to embark on it. In a similar way to 1000 Times Resist, a game so good it made me wish I was a gaming channel because I had so much to say, Piedras feels like it's about everything. The themes it tackles are so specific to our time, so directly linked to this moment we're living through today, and so universal that I don't think it would be possible to go through this piece without feeling a deep resonance and understanding between art and audience that transcends language, geography, and culture. This art transcends all of those things, but what it does not transcend by design is class. This is an album for the middle and underclass, an act of rebellion so direct, so potent, that it's almost a shame that it's in such an inaccessible shell. But at the same time, I don't think it would be nearly as potent were it not spoken in the languages of Chile and Palestine, or if it were forced down to a shorter runtime. This art demands to exist in its present form because anything less would be a needless sacrifice, and one of the core theses of this album is that we strive and act towards a world with no more needless sacrifice. I spent my entire first listen to this work highlighting passages and moments in the script that I felt were important to return to, studying it like a lecture, not because I had to, but because something deep in me required it. I could not, for 1 second, let this work of art pass me by, because who knows when the next time I'll be able to set aside this long runtime to give this thing my full attention again. I return to highlighted passages in this script almost daily, each one cementing in my mind as a fundamental building block of my day-to-day mindset. The biggest thematic angles of Piedras are commentary that is both directly about and implicitly referential to ongoing genocides like the ones happening in Palestine, and the critical effects that AI and the so-called metaverse are having on both our environment and our humanity. These two issues are inextricably linked, and the play does a remarkable job detangling and representing this link through the lens of a near future, one where AI and colonialism have grown in tandem to a breaking point when an underground revolutionary group called Las Ocho has crippled the world's power system, slowing the disastrous buildup of this seemingly unstoppable force at the cost of daily convenience for the world's population. Through this event, this fictional radio broadcast demonstrates the infallibility of human spirit as art and music continues to be made and celebrated even through this period of darkness, and real community becomes the default way of surviving in this world as multiculturalism becomes the only way forward for a society in shambles. There's a lot more to it than that. This thing is dense and impenetrable from an outside perspective, and by nature impossible to adequately describe, but I hope what I've said does some degree of justice to what this piece is doing on a very, very zoomed out scale. On a musical level, this is Nicholas Yar in peak form. The backing instrumentals that underpin these assorted recordings are nothing short of masterful, seeing Yar at his most abstract and evocative, but we also hear him compose genuine traditional Arabic pop songs to be scattered across this fictional radio show, representing Salinas, the subject of said show, which is being tributed after being long missing since 2022. These songs are powerful in their own right, but within the context of the play, they become almost unbearably emotional, a crushing and mournful representation of the songs of a revolution that we in the real world are witnessing and, with our tax dollars, unwillingly funding the destruction of. I want to leave you, finally, with a long quote from near the end of this piece to demonstrate to you just how powerful and devastating the prose on this piece is. I'll leave you with the mission to listen to Archivos de Radio Piedras yourself to find out where this paragraph fits into the broader narrative. I promise it's worth the time and effort. Here it is. The boy listened to all of this calmly, as if he had heard this before, and he kind of had. His own mother had told him so the day his dog died, which was really her dog. It followed her around everywhere. And when the dog died, his mother told him, "My boy, in the end, it's just you. It could be that I, not even I, exist. Yes, me who birthed you. I mean, maybe the fact that you exist makes me exist. It's possible, no? And I tell you that you came out of me, but in truth, maybe I came out of you. It's as if your mind is a womb." That's what I wanted to tell you, and it's gonna help you with the death of Caillou. I mean, I don't even know why you're crying. It wasn't even your dog, it was my dog. And anyways, you can cry all you want. It's not gonna change the fact that you became pregnant with his death, and yesterday his death was born. Archivos de Radio Piedras is the album of the year, if you can even call it that. This is a generational piece of art, the only one of its kind that has so perfectly encapsulated the time we live in now. Every conflict, every anxiety, every issue, interpersonal and political, and all the beauty and hope still to be found amidst those things, is contained within this perfect, perfect piece of work. Centuries from now, this will be held in the same regard we hold the great classical artistic works, as a cultural artifact and a key artistic window into the world that crumbles around us now. I'm proud to be alive at the same time that this exists. And that's my list. I want to go off script a little bit here and just like give some thoughts on the state of the channel. Apologies, my voice is a little bit shot because I did that whole recording in one sitting. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for letting me do this for another year. I have been not the most consistent, especially this year. I still managed to get like my standard 10 videos a year out, but it was like just barely because life stuff has just been even more in the way than usual. Which is why I especially want to again thank my patrons for making this something that I can hold myself to. Because when people are giving you money for your work, it feels a lot worse when you're missing deadlines. I'm gonna do, like I said, a follow-up video to this that's gonna be Patreon exclusive, where I'm just talking about completely unscripted like this, all the albums that didn't make the list, and also some albums that I listened to for the first time this year that I thought were really good and think you guys should check out. That's kind of all I wanted to say. My cat is here purring incredibly loud, so if you hear that, then enjoy. If not, I'm sorry. But yeah, happy New Year, and thank you for getting through to the end of this. Bye.